Good morning, everyone. Good morning. I want to welcome you to this discussion today. My name is Rita Young, and I am here with Dr. Kelli Bishop, the Director of Eligibility with DBHDD, the Department of Behavioral Health, Developmental Disabilities, the Division of Developmental Disabilities. And so we're going to just do a little bit of a test to be sure that you all can hear us and see us. So if you are watching this morning, rather, not outside, if you're watching this morning, please let us know that you're there. I see we have about 28 folks. So let's do a little test in the chat and tell us that you are there. And also tell us where you're watching from. And we'll start the discussion in just a moment. I just want to check to see that you're able to see us, hear us. So we're doing a little bit of a check. So who is going to be the first brave soul in the first minute to actually say, hello, I'm here, and where they're from? So let's see. We've got about 22-ish on, and that is on YouTube. So we're broadcasting this morning from Facebook and from YouTube. So let us know that you're watching. All right, here we go. No problems. All right, so thank you so much. Vicki saying from Catula. That is new, Vicki. Let us know what county that is in. But thank you for joining us, Vicki. And thank you for being brave enough also for the folks who have reached out. All right, so we've got here we go. Marietta, Natalie from Effingham, Chastain Horse Park. So you are listening outside. So I was correct. Someone is watching from the Atlanta area, Gwinnett County, no problems. Andrea from Gwinnett. All right, so thank you so much. Continue to let us know that you are there. And we're going to go ahead and start since it sounds like we are a go on the video and the audio side. So thank you so much, Dr. Kelli Bishop, for joining me today. And I just want to tell folks that what inspired me to reach out to you. And so last month, DBHDD had a board meeting, and you presented at that board meeting on the eligibility for now comp waivers. And so I happened to be listening that day. And after that presentation, I thought, wow, this would be a good conversation to have with families because there's so many questions and maybe myths about applying for the waiver, how do you apply, et cetera. And so I made the invitation, and I'm so grateful that you decided to accept. So thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So we're going to go ahead and tell us a little bit as we're waiting for folks to join us. It takes just a couple minutes. We have about 40 folks with us now, which is great. Tell us a little bit about your role with the division as eligibility director.
So I oversee the eligibility process and the psychologists that make the pre-eligibility determinations. And pre-eligibility is kind of a confusing word, so I do want to clarify that. Pre-eligibility determinations are the initial determinations that are made by DBHDD psychologists. So once a person's found pre-eligible, they'll be placed on the planning list. And when they meet the most in need status, the psychologist will then conduct a second review and make a recommendation as to whether the person meets current eligibility criteria. The final eligibility determination is actually made by Alliant Health Systems in accordance with DCH.
Okay. All right. So it is not solely then in your house. It is another agency, Alliant Health, you said, that is partnered with DCH.
Correct.
Okay.
So if it's pre-eligible, that's something DBHDD has decided. When it turns to eligible, that's something Alliant Healthcare Systems with DCH has determined.
Okay, so you're in pre-eligibility then?
Correct.
Okay, all right. But you're not the director of pre-eligibility. You're the director
I am not. It's confusing.
And that's why you're here. That's so great that you're here. So tell us a little bit about does your role. So in Georgia, we have what's called regional offices, and I'm going to attempt to bring that screen up so that you all can see it, but it's on the DBHDD website, and I'm going to show you where it is. Let's see. All right, so here we go. I cannot see Dr. Bishop any longer, but here's the DBHDD website that talks about the regional field offices. So, Dr. Bishop, can you see this
Yes.
on your side? Okay, great. So I'm hoping folks can see that because all I can see is the web page. So if you're looking for a place to start, might this be a place to start, Dr. Bishop?
Yes. Right, where it says find your region. So if you're looking for, like who do I contact? You can click find your region and it should pull up the main office number for you to call.
Okay, so I'm picking region 2, and there we go.
There it is.
Okay. All right. So tell us a little bit about how your role does it interface with the regional offices?
So I work most closely with the intake and evaluation team, and that's the team that works with individuals and their advocates to help them understand the needed documentation to provide for the psychologist to review. And so we'll talk about that in a little bit, but the psychologist is part of the intake and evaluation team, and they work closely with various members in the field office to help determine if somebody's eligible or not, and help everyone understand what documentation is needed.
And so I understand that there's an application process. And of course, not of course, but I'm a parent. I have 2 sons on the autism spectrum and who've had waivers for a little while. And the process has changed in that little while. And so what is, and I'm asking this with the understanding that you are director of eligibility, so you may not be able to answer every single question that I have, right? But in terms of just the basics, what is the best way to apply?
So we have a relatively new online system to apply, and that is preferable. However,
And I'm going to bring that up. Yeah, I'm going to bring that up as you're talking. Sorry to interrupt. Here we go.
No problem.
Do it again.
That's okay. Because it's new, though, we do request that you call the field office and let them know we submitted this online application, just because we want to make sure everything's working. We don't want to lose anybody or mistakenly not know something's there, because we need to make sure the system's working. So if you just call and let us know, hey, I turned in this application, then we can verify whether the system notified us that application was received.
Okay, so and I've brought up the place where families, you recommend that families go to this website, the Georgia Collaborative ASO, which is a partnership with DBHDD. And this is the actual IDD Connects where families can apply. And so if you need this website, I will put it in the video description as well once we're finished. And so on the website here, it looks like it says online IDD waiver application. And what you're recommending, again, is to go on the website, apply, and then follow up with a phone call to your respective regional office, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Let me go to waiver IDD application and see. Okay, so here we are. So it will require families to create an account, rather. And then, and this is my internet connection probably over here thinking, because it was working yesterday. If families need it in Spanish, if you look at the upper right-hand corner, if you all can see that, can you see that, Dr. Bishop?
Yes, ma'am.
On your side? Okay. It says in Spanish, so this can change to Spanish, so just know that as well. Okay. And I'm going to go back. Okay. And someone asked and sent questions in, if a parent doesn't have access, is there a paper to do it online? Is there a paper application?
There is. So you can access the paper application on the website, but if you don't have internet access, that would be a problem. So you can call the field office, and the field office will help you obtain a paper application through them.
Okay.
You can also apply by mail, fax, dropping it off at the regional office, in addition to the online portal.
Okay. And we just showed folks where to find things in Spanish. If there are other languages that folks need a translation, what would you recommend?
Well, I would recommend you let the field office know. So call the
Okay.
field office so that we can help that person through the application process. We do have access to interpreters and the Office of Deaf Services. So we also have ASL interpreters as well as multiple language interpreters.
Okay, so that's good to know. And as we're talking about applications, here is an extensive list of the documentation that is required. Is there anything that you would like to add about any of the items on the list? It's quite extensive. Is there anything else that we might need to know?
So some things I like to say about the psychological evaluation. So all documents need to be signed. So if it's not signed, we will request a signature on the document. And then we really need the psych evals to have thorough adaptive testing with subdomain and domain scores. That's really key for the application process. And we typically do require a full-scale IQ, but if one can't be administered, if the person for some reason isn't able to engage in all the testing components, we just need the psychologist to explain why.
Okay.
So that then if we're questioned on it later, we can provide an explanation of, this person was unable to complete the testing process for this reason. So we are looking for a full-scale IQ, not an abbreviated or a partial, unless there's something interfering, the person's not able to engage in full testing. And we're looking for thorough adaptive testing, which includes domain and subdomain scores. And then we're looking for the signatures.
Okay. So as a layperson, we would have to specifically talk to the school about this, or is this already a part of a typical school psychological?
Usually the school will do some sort of testing, but we are noticing that there are different versions of the Vineland that has come out that does not include the domain and subdomain scores. So we're noticing recently that we're having to clarify that a lot. And so I've created some things to help with that as far as like meeting with school districts and presentations and things like that. But in the process, I think it's good for parents to know that too. If you're going to go out and get testing for your child, make sure they do the version that has the subdomain and the domain scores.
Okay, so that's important to note. Anything else about the documentation that we might need to know about?
So we look for developmental milestones, developmental history. We're looking for ideally an evaluation early in childhood and then an evaluation around 16, 17 years of age. And we need to be able to provide evidence that the developmental disability occurred during the developmental period. So we're really looking for what was their functioning during the developmental period. When did they achieve their developmental milestones? IEPs are helpful. Sometimes we get things from community services that are really helpful. Any documentation that you can provide that will help us understand who your loved one is and how they clinically present will help us to make our decision.
So if, and some of us keep all of that forever, right? All of that documentation. So if we have documentation, say, for example, from Babies Can't Wait, which say maybe was 15 years ago or something, and then IEPs, a lot of us keep all the IEPs. So it is quite a bit of documentation. Is there such a thing as giving you too much?
I've always said no. You send me 1,000 pages and I'll read 1,000 pages.
Okay.
We'll determine whether or not, a certain document is helpful or not. But I've always, said, send us what you have, send us all the information you have, and we'll go through it. We'll review
Okay.
it.
So more is better than less.
Mhm.
And so if we had our school IEPs from all years and sent you the present levels from every year, that may be helpful.
Yes.
Okay. Anything else about the resources, I mean, excuse me, the documents that you require?
Not that I
I
can
mean,
think
this
of offhand. Do we have any questions about them?
let me stop sharing and go back where I can see everybody. Let's see here. Okay. Are there any questions on the documentation that folks have? Here's one, but I think you may have. Okay, this is actually an interesting question, and I thought about this, so thank you for bringing it up. How recent does an eval need to be if someone is an adult in their 50s? So we could be talking about someone who has never accessed services, or maybe they've moved from another state. Can you talk on this particular question?
This is a very common question. And it really depends on what was in that evaluation that was done 20 years ago or 30 years ago. Sorry. So if it has everything that we need to make a decision, then no, we don't need another one. But there are times when it doesn't have, maybe they didn't do adaptive testing 30 years ago. And so we will have to obtain that. So it really depends on the person, what's in the evaluation, what their clinical presentation is. And that's kind of why I said a few minutes ago, we do prefer one in early childhood and then one around 16, 17 years of age. But honestly, it really depends on what's in that evaluation and the clinical presentation of that person.
Okay, okay, that's helpful. Are there any other questions rather about the documentation that's required? So let's just focus on documentation for just a little bit and see if we have any other questions here. And thank you, by the way. We have representation from all across the state. Macon, Wayne County, Adairsville. Okay, any other questions on documentation? And then we'll move on. Okay, so if you could walk us through. So the application is filled out. Okay, here we go. Here's something. All right, here we go. Thank you, Mr. or Ms. Fuchs. The domains and subdomains are new requirements. Are these referenced in the federal IDD definition? Is that something that you'd be able to answer, Dr. Bishop?
I don't see them as new requirements. They've always been requirements. It's just, so when you do an adaptive test, how do I explain this? I'm sorry. I want to make this clear so you guys understand.
Take your time. Take your time.
It's part of adaptive testing. It just is. So when you do adaptive testing, there are subtests, and then they use the scores from those subtests to get your domain scores. And we basically just need all the scores. Sometimes we'll get a few scores, but we don't get all of them. But in order to make our determination, we need to have all of them. So basically, they just need to administer their adaptive test. What has changed is specifically with the Vineland Adaptive Behavior Scales is now they have versions that don't test as thoroughly as the original version did. And so what we want is the comprehensive version, which will provide all those scores for us. If you don't do the comprehensive version, then you end up with a test that doesn't have the subdomain scores and all the different scores that we need to look at.
So if we as family members ask for the comprehensive Vineland test, are we asking for the correct thing? Okay.
Yes, or the ABOS, the Adaptive Behavior Assessment System. Either of those are fine. We've been using them for years. So I don't really see it as a new requirement. It's the same as the old, just the Vineland changed their test a little bit.
Okay. So let's just stick with, I do have another question on documentation. Are there any common mistakes in documentation that you see that we could perhaps avoid?
So the most common mistakes we have are missing signatures or missing pages of the documentation. We will request those missing pages or the missing signatures. Oftentimes it's just you fax something over and a page didn't come through. We need to request it. And then they just refax it to us. The next common mistakes are what we just talked about. There's no subdomain scores with the adaptive functioning. And then it's really helpful, like I discussed earlier, if full-scale IQ can't be obtained, if the evaluator explains why.
And so thinking about perhaps someone that is older or moved from out of state, doesn't have a current psychological, someone is asking here, does the department do the psychological if none exists?
It depends on the situation. So often we'll refer to the school system if they're in school. If they're older, we are the payer of last resort. So if they're older, they're adults, we know that Medicaid isn't going to cover the testing. We do see those people in person.
Okay, so I think Bet is asking this the same thing here. If an individual does not have an adequate psych test and cannot afford to pay for one, can the region perform the evaluation? And it sounds like the answer to that is yes.
The short answer is
The short answer. Okay. So if that does occur, you would, of course, recommend, or would you, to work those details out with the field office, right? That's where families would go to make that request. Okay.
Yep.
So we've talked about common mistakes, missing signatures, and the testing is perhaps not adequate, and that does slow things down a little bit, right? When they're even just missing a signature here and there will slow the process down a little bit.
Correct.
Okay. So in terms of eligibility, who develops the eligibility criteria for the Now Comp waiver? Is it DCH? Is it DBHDD? Is it both?
So DBHDD develops the criteria, DCH approves it, and then the final approval is provided by CMS.
Okay. So DBHDD develops, DCH approves it, and then CMS, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid, they make the final approval. Is that what you just said?
Correct.
Okay. All right. I'm taking notes here too. Is there a diagnosis that is considered pre-eligible?
So that's a common question too. So a diagnosis in itself will not make somebody pre-eligible. There's two paths towards pre-eligibility. One is under intellectual disability, which requires global, consistent, and indefinite significant deficits in cognitive and adaptive functioning with onset during the developmental period prior to age 18. The second is under a closely related condition, which is defined as a condition which impacts the brain such that it has similar impact and requires similar interventions as to an intellectual disability. And so to meet that eligibility criteria, you must have significant deficits in adaptive functioning as a result of the condition prior to age 18. And those deficits must be expected to be indefinite and cannot be attributed to exclusionary conditions, which would be like mental health disorders, sensory impairment, solely physical conditions, learning disability, dementia, ADHD, etc.
But if someone is duly diagnosed, say they have autism and mental health, they would still be eligible to apply for a DD waiver, correct?
Anyone can apply.
Okay. So you've talked a little bit about needing a full-scale IQ. Could you explain a little bit more about the IQ and adaptive skills? In that first presentation at the board meeting, I thought I heard you say that IQ scores are taken into consideration, but not a sole determinant in eligibility. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
So the score needs to be consistent with the clinical presentation of the individual. So there may be situations in which IQ scores are depressed or lower than the person's actual capability due to factors that aren't related to the intellectual disability, maybe depression, psychosis, low motivation, or effort. So it's really important to us to look at the score and evaluate the score to see why it is what it is, how it relates to the individual's clinical presentation, and how consistent the score is with other assessments that have been completed.
So if someone has a, say, 63 or something, so there's no cutoff number. That's not the case in what you all do. You look at everything, correct?
Well, our criteria does say significant, so 2 standard deviations below the mean. However, that has to be consistent with so it does also say it has to be consistent with an intellectual disability. So if you have an IQ of, say, 90 today, but tomorrow you score a 63, we're really going to have a lot of questions about how you ended up with that 90, because IQ tests are, the way that they're designed is to, I want to make sure I say this in a way that's understood. I don't want to just give you a bunch of psychobabble. But the way they're designed is you can't score higher than your capacity on them. There's a lot of testing and a lot of practice versions and a lot of work that goes into making sure that they're designed so that you can't score higher than what your capacity is.
Okay.
So we have to look at the entire picture to make sure that this person's presentation is consistent with an intellectual disability.
So if someone says, I was always told low 70s was kind of cut off, that is not true? True?
So 70 would be the cutoff if it's consistent with an intellectual disability.
Okay. And is age a factor in eligibility? So say someone applies at the age of 16 or 14, or can you talk to, is age an eligibility factor for now comp?
So as we were talking about earlier, there's the 2 pathways. So for intellectual disability, full onset of the condition before age 18 is required. And then for a closely related condition, full onset before age 22.
Okay. But in terms of applying for a waiver, age is not a factor? Someone doesn't have to be a graduate from high school, or there is no cutoff in that respect?
No.
Okay. Because I think that is, we hear that too as families, that waivers are, quote, not allowed before graduating high school, and you're saying that's not the case. So if someone does not meet eligibility for now comp for whatever reason, what are other options that might be offered to a family, and are other options offered?
So an aging and disability resource connection specialist will reach out to the family to discuss appropriate referral sources. That might include another waiver program, vocational rehabilitation, mental health services, organizations that work with specific populations, like there's Gigi's Playhouse that works with people who have Down syndrome. So it just kind of depends on the person and what their needs are, but that is the purpose of the Aging and Disability Resource Connection Specialist, is to offer referral sources.
So if someone is deemed to be not eligible, they will automatically get a referral. So someone, you said an aging and DD specialist will reach out to them, or the family member has to reach out to them?
The specialist will reach out to the family.
Okay. So that's good to hear. And there is is there an appeals process if someone doesn't agree with the decision? Okay.
Yeah. So if somebody's determined ineligible, they'll be sent a letter, and the letter gives them time frame to respond, and they can request either have a division review or a fair hearing. So if you want a division review, that would be a psychologist at central office who reviews the file, and they have the authority to overturn the ineligibility decision if they disagree with that decision. If you do choose that route, you can still choose fair hearing later. So if you choose a division review and you don't like the decision that the psychologist at central office made, you can still request a fair hearing, which would be going to court.
Okay. Okay, so there are options if families don't agree with the decision. So I think this is the biggest question that will walk us through, and then we'll take questions from folks as well. But if you could walk us through that eligibility process based on your role. So after the application is submitted, what happens next? What happens next? And we'll take some questions after that.
Okay. So you submit an application. The documents are organized and they're prepared for the psychologist to review. If any additional documentation is needed, a representative from the field office will request that information from whoever submitted the application. A psychologist will review the documentation. They'll make a determination. If they're pre-eligible, if they say the person is pre-eligible, a letter will go out to the individual indicating the pre-eligibility. If the person is ineligible, a letter will be sent to the individual indicating the ineligible finding and then offering those opportunities to appeal that we just discussed. So individuals who are pre-eligible are then put on the planning list. And then when they meet most in need status or most in need criteria, they'll be reviewed by the psychologist a second time. I think I mentioned that earlier, that they'll be reviewed a second time by the psychologist, and then we will send everything to Alliant for final determination. And then if Alliant determines a person's eligible, the DBHDD will continue the enrollment process to award a waiver. And if Alliant determines they're ineligible, the person will still be offered the opportunity to appeal the decision.
Okay. So let me see if I have this straight.
I know.
I'm going to try to repeat it back to you. Let's see. All right. So families go online, they fill out the application, they send you all the documentation that is required, and then they call their field office to check to make sure everything's been received. Then it goes to your department to determine if they are pre-eligible. If they're ineligible, they will be receiving that call from the aging and DD folks for other resources. Okay. If they are determined pre-eligible, then they go to the planning list, which is operated by Most in Need, and we'll talk about that in a second. I don't know how much you can talk about that. Someone's just asked about that in the chat. And once a slot becomes available, it will be reviewed by a second time by a psychologist. Then it will go to Alliant for a final review, and then the individual will receive waiver funding. Did I get that correct?
If Alliant agrees with our decision, then
okay.
Yeah.
If they agree, okay.
And if they don't, then they'll be offered an appeal option.
Okay.
At that point.
So basically, there are 3 different psychologists or 2 psychologists and Alliant that review the application.
It could be
in the process.
It could be one psychologist who does the first review and also does a second review, or it could be a different psychologist as well.
Okay. So there's a first review, there's a second review, and then Alliant is the final review.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
If the person's been found pre-eligible.
Okay, if they've been found pre-eligible. Okay, so let's go through some questions and see if that is clear to folks. Someone is asking about, and I don't know if you can answer this, but someone is asking about Most in Need tool. And I know that's outside of your department. Someone is asking, can Dr. Bishop discuss the Most in Need assessment tool used for the short and long-term planning list? Can you give us some more details on that? Is that possible, or how would we find out more?
So if that person would like to send me an email, I can connect that person with the team who does the needs assessment.
Okay, so the needs assessment is outside of your department, and your email is at the very top. So if folks scroll to the top of the chat, you're going to see Dr. Bishop's email. And so you may be inundated by emails this afternoon, Dr. Bishop, but
Send them.
we're
It's
hoping that's
okay.
okay because I think several people were asking, at least a couple people, about the most in need assessment tool. Okay. Here is another question, and feel free, folks, at this point to ask a question on the application, the process for pre-eligibility. So let's go ahead and take some questions here. We're told that waivers are not given to people while they're still in school. Then we see others get the waiver. It's frustrating. I really like to understand who or how waivers are awarded. And I guess that goes to the most in need question, perhaps. And Dr. Bishop, I'll let you say what you can about that.
Yeah, again, if you email me, I can direct you to because I don't have any, I don't do anything with that process. I'm not involved in it. But if you email me, I'm happy to direct you to someone who can answer your question.
Okay, and so again, to that Facebook user, if you scroll to the top of the chat, you're going to see Dr. I'm going to show that to you. There it is. Mm-hmm. If you would like to have the email address, go ahead and take a picture or write this down, but there it is. Okay. Other questions, folks? Here's something, which I think is interesting. It is confusing. Why does it have to be confusing? Why can't DBHDD and other agencies work together to simplify the process? Is there anything that you could say for that comment? Because it can be confusing. I want to just validate that.
I agree. But we are doing our best to try and make it less confusing. That's part of the reason I'm here. That's part of the reason I'm reaching out to the community and doing more presentations, reaching out to clinicians, and helping them understand what we need. So other psychologists in the community. I love getting feedback. So if you want to give me more details on what's confusing, that will help us to make the process smoother. We do try to make it as smooth as possible. It is difficult when you have so many people you're working with because people are dynamic and they're all different and everybody, has their own presentation clinically. But we do try our best to make this as simple as possible. And any feedback that we get, we do look at that and review it to see what can we do about this? What can we do to make this easier? What can we do to help people better understand what's needed? So we do appreciate that that feedback. And I do encourage you to email me and let me know what suggestions you might have or what you find confusing so that we can work on making it a more understandable and easier to navigate process.
Here's a question from Mr. Roberson, Antoine. How can someone meet eligibility for SSI disability benefits but is denied the now comp waiver? Is that something you can answer, perhaps?
The criteria is different, and I can't tell you what the SSI disability benefits criteria is because I do not work for SSI disability. That would be something that they would have to explain, but the criteria is different. SSI is more federal, whereas the now comp waivers are state, and we have a federal contract, but each state has their own federal contract. So even eligibility will vary from state to state as well. But it just comes down to there's different eligibility criteria.
So eligibility for Medicaid waivers, you said could vary from state to state?
Correct.
Okay. And someone is asking about the most in need. Is that person Dr. Thompson?
Yes.
Okay, here's another question here. Our child turns 17, turns 18 in September, currently on insurance. When should we start the application process?
Now.
Okay, that's a pretty quick answer.
Now, okay. We like to get the applications early. The earlier, the better. So Now, if it's too early, if you have an infant who can't engage in the IQ testing yet, we're going to need to wait until we can get that testing. But we do like to be aware of people early on in the process, and we may ask for updated. So keep that in mind. All those documents you keep those, because we may ask for updated evaluations or IEPs down the line. But we do prefer to know sooner than later, because it does take time and it is confusing, and we want to have everything set up and ready to go so that if there's ever a crisis or something happens, it's all put in place for the person who needs it.
Here's another question. Can a 13-year-old with Williams syndrome possibly be eligible for the waiver?
It's a possibility.
And then here's another one. What's the time frame from when the packet is received to the decision letter being sent? What is your average turnaround time?
It's really dependent on the documentation we receive and what's in that documentation. If we get everything we need, typically it's about 2 to 3 weeks for that letter to reach you. But if we need more documentation or something's not signed or there's a page missing, that puts delays in the process.
Okay, so triple check all your documentation then.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Or sometimes if we need updated testing, that takes time because then the testing has to be scheduled.
If an individual, Pat Satterfield, if an individual has been on the planning list for a long time, do they ever have to have eligibility reviewed? Or once you're pre-eligible, are you always eligible and just sort of on the planning list?
So it will be reviewed a second time before the person is sent to Alliant. So we, because if you're pre-eligible and you've been on the planning list for a long time, I'm not sure what the definition of a long time is.
Let's say several years, yeah.
Eligibility criteria may have changed in that time frame, or we may need updated testing to help provide evidence for that person. So they'll go back for a second review with the psychologist.
Okay. Let's see if we have any other questions. Okay, someone says, can the application have terms explained so that people can complete it easier? Parents are stressed that it is very hard for them to complete. Is it possible to have assistance for families to complete applications being administered by school?
Can you put that back up? Sorry.
Yeah, sure. It's okay. Yeah, it hides your face. That's why it's a long question.
So yes, you can receive assistance filling out the application by calling the field office. I would be really interested in knowing what terms are confusing so that maybe we could make a change in the applications. So if you could email me about that, that would be great. We do receive applications from school districts. I'm not sure, that's up to the school district. I'm not sure how that happens or why that decision is made, but we do receive them from school districts. But you can call the field office to get assistance if you need it.
But typically it's submitted by family members, not typically the school system. Or am I right about that?
I'm really not sure.
Okay.
I do know we get them from the school district, but I'm not sure, like, comparison wise, what percentage of what we get. And it may vary by school district too.
My child receives the comp waiver. How long will she continue to receive the services?
So that's another question to email me about.
Yeah. Differences between now comp. I don't know if that's something that you can answer either, or is it?
That's another email question.
Okay. Okay, here we go. Here's another eligibility. What's the current pre-eligibility from Sheena criteria for adaptive scores? Could a person be deemed pre-eligible with subdomain scores above 70?
So the short answer is no. So it's what we say 2 standard deviations below the mean, which is 70.
Okay. Okay, our school system special ed coordinator didn't understand about the waiver. Well, it sounds like that DBH or the division is doing some more outreach, perhaps.
Yeah,
Okay.
if you can have that person email me, I'd be happy to speak with them, help clarify anything, and what I can't clarify, direct them to the appropriate person.
Here's another one from Jane. Should a family on the planning list contact the regional office regularly to update the status of their child who has been deemed pre-eligible?
If there are any significant changes.
Significant changes meaning um, someone has moved, obviously, that would be a change.
Death of a caregiver,
Okay.
something significant.
Major. Okay. Okay. Here it is. When someone's placed on the planning list, what time frame should be expected between the planning list and the alliance step?
That goes back to our most in need criteria. So if you can email me that question.
Okay. Are there other questions from folks? I am just scrolling to see if there's some that we have not answered. If there's anything person's entitled to. Okay, how about this? Let's see. I don't know if we answered this. Is a person entitled to eligibility final determination versus pre-eligibility? Thinking that waivers are an entitlement. Can a person be required to planning list placement if they meet eligibility for entitlement? I'm not sure if I get that. Is that a question that?
I'm not sure I understand the question, but
Okay.
I will say that although it's not super common, you can be found pre-eligible and then be on the planning list and then be found ineligible later. But that's not a super common thing, but it does happen.
Okay, I think this is part of that same question. To clarify, skip the planning list.
I don't think you can skip
that-
the planning list.
Yeah, right. Other questions, folks? I'm going to just scroll to see if there's any that I missed here. I think we have all of the questions. I'm going to scroll a little bit. I'll tell you what, I'm going to put this up again. And I typed this in earlier. And so that is Dr. Bishop's email address. If we don't have any further questions, okay, let me just scroll a little bit. Is SSI required before the waiver is approved? Is that a deciding factor in any way, shape, or form?
No.
No. Okay. Someone is saying to clarify what grade to apply for waiver.
I would apply as soon as you get that first psych eval.
Okay, so whenever that is for psych eval. Okay.
Because we can't make a determination without the psych eval.
Okay. Jane says, but do you have to be Medicaid eligible?
To apply? Mm-mm.
Okay. Okay, any other questions, folks? All right, so with that, if you do have any other questions that I have missed or any questions that I have missed, you can send them to Dr. Bishop. Here's her email address. I want to thank you all for participating in the chat today. This video will be archived both on YouTube and in my Facebook group called Real Talk with Rita, but definitely also on YouTube if you would like to share it or distribute it to the families that you work with. Thank you so much, Dr. Bishop, for taking this interview today. And everyone, you have a wonderful rest of your day, and we will be in touch.
Thank you. I look forward to emails. Send them my way.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bishop.